Hola, buenas tardes. Este es el ciclo de lenguaje y predicción. Disculpen el retraso, teníamos unos problemas técnicos. Es un gusto para nosotras, es el día de hoy contar con la presencia de la doctora Fernanda Ferreira y de la postulante al doctorado, Beverly Teresa Cotter. Le cedo la palabra a Mitzi Castellón.
Hola, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en este seminario. A continuación daré la presentación de nuestras dos ponentes. Comenzaremos con la doctora Fernanda Ferreira. La doctora Fernanda Ferreira es egresada de la licenciatura en Psicología por la Universidad de Manitoba, en Canadá, con maestrías en Psicología y Lingüística por la Universidad de Massachusetts, institución en la que también realizó su doctorado en Psicología. Actualmente, desde hace varios años, es profesora de la Universidad de California, Davis. Además de su papel académico, la doctora Ferreira es editora en jefe de la revista Glossa Psycholinguistics. La doctora Ferreira ha ganado numerosos premios, incluido el Premio Científico Distinguido de la Asociación Estadounidense de Psicología. Este premio lo recibió en 1996 por contribuciones tempranas a la psicología. En su área de investigación, la doctora Ferreira aplica conocimientos fundamentales de lingüística formal para el desarrollo de modelos de procesamiento. Su trabajo empírico se basa tanto en medidas conductuales como en medidas neurales. El objetivo fundamental de su investigación es descubrir los mecanismos que permiten a los seres humanos comprender y generar lenguaje en tiempo real y en comparación con otros sistemas cognitivos. Por su parte, Beverly Cotter es estudiante de doctorado del tercer año en Psicología en la Universidad de California, Davis. Asimismo, es miembro del área de percepción, cognición y neurociencia cognitiva en la que trabaja con la doctora Fernanda Ferreira. Su principal línea de investigación es la comprensión del lenguaje bilingüe a nivel oracional. También le interesa saber si las diferencias individuales en la capacidad de la memoria de trabajo predicen el procesamiento. Thank you very much for joining us in this seminar. Ready? You can start your presentation. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you so much. Just need to share my screen. I don't know if I have the ability to. I think I might need to be a co-host for the Zoom call. Sorry, before we begin, just so I can share my Zoom slides.
Evelyn, ¿podemos hacer las co-hosts para que puedan presentar, por favor?
Under share screen, you can also just pick multiple, and that will also work.
Perfect. All right. Going to share my screen. Sorry, I'm just going to move this over. Oops. Okay. Does this look okay? Perfect. Okay. So, hi everyone. My name is Beverly Cotter. I am one of Dr. Fernanda Ferreira's graduate students at the University of California, Davis. And I'll be talking a little bit about my dissertation work on predicting syntactic structure, evidence from adjective placement in Spanish. Before jumping in, I just wanted to provide a very quick overview of what I will be talking about today. So I'll start this off with some background information about the premise behind this work and some of the conversations that Dr. Ferreira and I had leading up to this work. And then I will jump into talking about the first study that we ran together that was related to acceptability judgments, where we wanted to decide if the avenue that we were going down was correct. And that'll be kind of a big chunk of the presentation today. And then I'll be talking about our next steps and what we're doing right now and what we hope to do in the next coming months, and I'd love any thoughts or feedback that you all have, and I look forward to any questions that you might have as well. So this big sort of central question that I've been trying to answer with our work is, how does a bilingual's second language impact how they process their first language? And through the following work, we have the two following aims. So the current research aims to explore the mechanisms of syntactic prediction in bilinguals and examine predictive processing in the first language, which throughout the talk, I'll be referring to that as L1, so first language. And through this, we hope to examine the relationship between adjective placement, language history, and first language processing while focusing on the linguistic structure known as an ellipsis or noun emission. And this will all make sense too throughout the presentation as I talk about each chunk and how they're related to each other. But first off, very broadly speaking, prediction is essential for successful language processing, right? So let's say you have the following, sorry, let me just readjust my screen to this. Okay, so oops, I have to move this, love technical difficulties. So let's say you have the following sentence: the day was breezy, so the boy went outside to fly a kite. So we would expect the word kite to appear next due to semantic constraints imposed by the sentence. When you read the following sentence or hear the following sentence in English, you would most likely expect that something like kite would appear because semantically that makes the most sense with what you are doing and what you're hearing. So I realize now, sorry, I might have to backtrack for a second. I have to reshare my screen because I realize that the way I am doing this is probably not the most effective. I'm so sorry, just one moment. I'm gonna redo this. Okay, perfect. I think this should hopefully work now. I'm just going to share a portion of my screen and we're just gonna do that. Okay, that should hopefully work better now. Okay, so moving on. So most notably, research in the visual world paradigm has demonstrated that listeners actively predict upcoming linguistic information before it's actually processed using semantic and morphosyntactic cues from processed spoken language. So for example, if a listener views a visual scene such as the following, consisting of a cake and various distractor objects while listening to sentences such as "the boy will move the cake" or "the boy will eat the cake," their gaze will fixate on the depiction of cake before the onset of the spoken word cake if the sentence contains the verb eat, because, you know, from this image, we see that the cake is the only edible object in the scene, right? There's a toy car, a ball, and it seems like some kind of train set, right? So the cake is the only edible object. And while participants were listening to the sentence with the verb move, on the other hand, fixations on the cake would not expect to begin until the onset of the word cake, because, you know, there are quite a few objects in this scene that could be moved. So what this really demonstrates is that listeners utilize selectional information carried by verbs to facilitate prediction of potential objects. And this was really one of the first sort of big empirical investigations of semantic prediction to begin with. In the same vein, syntactic prediction is essentially applied in any account of semantic prediction. So in the earlier example that I showed you, the anticipation of the word kite based on semantic constraints also implies that a singular noun was anticipated as well. So we have a kite, right, based off of what we read in the sentence. And similarly, if we change the determiner from a to those, you'll likely predict that a plural noun phrase such as paper planes or kites or something similar will appear next, right? But this big sort of central question that you know, I had from a lot of this work and that Fernanda and I talked about is, what does this look like in bilinguals? And despite the widespread occurrence of syntactic prediction in our daily lives, much of the research in this area has concentrated on monolinguals. And given the prevalence of bilingualism, it's important to really ask how, you know, prediction operates in bilingual and non-native sentence processing. So, right, we're left with this big question of what does this look like? And that'll be sort of the big overarching topic of the rest of my talk today. So the current work aims to explore the mechanisms of syntactic prediction in Spanish-English bilinguals and examine how language history affects predictive processing in the first language. And like I mentioned before, we'll be focusing on the linguistic structure known as an ellipsis in Spanish, and I'll further talk about this and what this looks like as well. And off of this, taking a step back, but really attempting to understand, can participants use their grammatical knowledge to infer upcoming words and structure? So before we begin, when Fernanda and I were talking about this work, we said, okay, we want to look at Spanish-English bilinguals. UC Davis has a large population, large sample of Spanish-English bilinguals. And I'll talk more about this throughout my talk, but I consider myself to be a heritage speaker of Spanish. My language history background is a little bit uncommon or unconventional, I think, to other heritage speakers, but my mom was born and raised in Peru and spoke Spanish to me growing up. But today, at 25 years old, I primarily only speak to her in English, and she only speaks to me in Spanish. And I spoke Spanish much more as a child, not so much anymore, but you know, it's still an everyday part of my life. And that's kind of always been why I've been very interested in, you know, understanding this sort of central question that I talked about earlier. And UC Davis has a great sample of heritage speakers like myself and people who have two parents who speak Spanish primarily and have grown up speaking it. So we said, you know, let's look at Spanish-English bilinguals and go from there. So when we decided to do that, we were thinking, okay, a way to be able to study syntactic prediction in Spanish-English bilinguals is to look at grammar differences or syntactic differences that exist between Spanish and English. And there are a few different properties, right? So Spanish and English do have distinct grammars. And one notable difference is in adjective placement. So as you all know, Spanish descriptive adjectives are typically post-nominal. So you would say something in English like the responsible student, where responsible, the adjective, is pronominal. So in English with descriptive adjectives, we always put them before the noun. So they're always pronominal. In Spanish, right, it sort of depends on the adjective and what adjective you're using and the context, but several descriptive adjectives are typically post-nominal. So that's already one sort of key difference, I would say, between the two languages. And there's been some work on this in adjective placement, but a lot of it has been done on children. And they found that bilingual children raised in English-dominant environments in the United States tend to generate more grammatical word strings in their L1, so in Spanish. So when they're, let's say, looking at an object like a train set or something, a big train, and they're asked to explain what they see, a lot of those children would make word string errors. So they would actually put the adjective before the noun, when in Spanish, it should really take place after the noun. So they would say like the train big, right? In Spanish, or they would need to say that, but instead they would say the big train, which is the structure that we would encounter in English. So already that's sort of indicating that bilingual children, there might be some sort of influence between their two languages happening. And, you know, that's what they found, but that's really the only work that has been done on this. And in the same vein, another intriguing aspect of adjective placement is what we refer to as nominal ellipsis or noun omission in Spanish, where nominal constructions seem to lack a lexical head noun. And this is seen in Spanish and Indo-European languages. So, for example, if we take the sentence, compré la falda negra y la amarilla, this directly translates to, I bought the black shirt and the yellow in English. So the first sentence in Spanish, according to you know, nominal ellipsis work, this would be considered perfectly grammatical in Spanish. But in English, I bought the black skirt and the yellow would not be considered grammatically acceptable. In English, we would need something like one added to the yellow in order for it to be considered grammatically acceptable in English. And for instance, noun omission can often be used when describing people. So, you know, you can refer to someone in Spanish as el inteligente, to just refer to them as the intelligent person, or el guapo, la bonita, so on and so forth. But in English, you know, you would need to say something like the pretty person, the handsome man, the handsome person. You know, it wouldn't be considered, you know, this construction is not grammatically acceptable in English to just simply say the intelligent or the pretty or the handsome, right? We would need a noun to follow after the adjective. So before I move on, I just wanted to provide a very quick summary of everything that I've talked about so far in the context of what's considered grammatically acceptable in Spanish versus English. For instance, in English, so the adjective noun construction would not be considered grammatically acceptable in Spanish in this context, but it is grammatically acceptable in English, the responsible student. Noun adjective would be grammatically acceptable in Spanish, but the student responsible is not grammatically acceptable in English. And then adjective only, just to refer to someone as the responsible, according to nominal constructions, would be considered grammatical in Spanish, but the responsible, just simply referring to someone as the responsible in English is not grammatically acceptable. And that'll be kind of the primary nominal ellipsis that will be the primary syntactic structure that we're going to be using today to be able to study syntactic prediction. So why an ellipsis? Why noun omission? So I've already talked a little bit about this, but this structure really provides an excellent opportunity to study syntactic prediction. Under this umbrella of adjective placement, it allows us to study the effects of adjective placement and determine whether individuals can accurately predict that an adjective is really replacing a noun. The noun adjective ordering in Spanish, if comprehenders get an adjective without having also received a noun, then they can hopefully infer that they're in a noun omission context, and then thus they can infer the upcoming verb, and they would be, perfectly content with receiving a noun and not, or receiving an adjective and not have to have a noun paired with that adjective. And again, I mentioned this question before, but this is really kind of, taking a step back, this sort of big, broad question related to prediction that we hope to answer with this work is, can participants use their grammatical knowledge to infer upcoming words? So just to further illustrate this point, let's say participant is reading or listening to the following sentence. So, la chica está buscando guapo. So let's say someone's listening to this and they say, oh yes, I know, the adjective guapo is replacing a noun, so I'm in a noun omission context, because the adjective or the noun would actually have to have already appeared. We would have to say el hombre guapo or something else, right? So because the participant has already been faced with the adjective guapo, then hopefully, people infer that they're in a noun omission context. And that's going back to what I said earlier about the noun adjective ordering principle in Spanish, is that if participants get an adjective without also having a noun, received a noun, then they should, infer that they're in a noun omission context, and therefore infer the upcoming relative pronoun and subsequent verb, like in the rest of the sentence. So, la chica está buscando el guapo que tiene un gato. But this really hasn't been studied before. Really, a lot of the noun omission and noun ellipsis work in Spanish and in English, and really any language that I've been able to find, has been done from a linguistic analysis perspective. There's really no experimental work on this. So Fernanda and I decided that before we could use this structure to hopefully be able to study predictions and syntactic predictions specifically, we had to norm our stimuli. We had to make sure that, our participants were happy with these stimuli, that they made sense. So this was really kind of the first starting ground for this work and what I'll be talking about next. And that leads to study one, which is where we conducted an acceptability judgment study to better understand how Spanish-English bilinguals process these, or rate rather, these nominal constructions in Spanish. So in the following study, we gave participants an acceptability judgment task where they rated sentences on a scale of 1 to 5, so 1 being not acceptable, and then 5 being very acceptable. They read through 40 experimental sentences, and those sentences were divided up into 4 conditions based on adjective noun placement and omission. So about 10 of the sentences were adjective plus noun. So el guapo hombre, and that adjective noun sequence was put into a sentence. So participants weren't just looking at el guapo hombre, they were looking at that in a sentence, like in the sentence that I just shown on the other screen. And then they read through about 10 sentences that were in the noun omission structure, so adjective only, so el guapo. 10 sentences in the noun adjective structure, so el hombre guapo, which is the considered grammatically acceptable construction in Spanish. And then a noun only condition where we wouldn't expect participants to have any issues with these sentences because they're just sort of control sentences as you can look at it. And then participants also read through 25 filler sentences, so they didn't pick up really on the main nature of the task, and also, they didn't experience hopefully any fatigue, and we were able to control for that and remove any participants that were not doing so well on the task. And we included catch trials to be able to do that. And then just to be able to collect very simple demographic information on our participants, on their self-reported proficiencies in Spanish and English, what age they started speaking Spanish, what age they started speaking English, so on and so forth. We included a language experience and proficiency questionnaire, otherwise known as the LEAP-Q. And then here's a snapshot of what the 4 different conditions, so el guapo hombre, el guapo, el hombre guapo, y el hombre, looked like in the 4 sentences that we showed participants. And then to jump to our participants, so all participants considered Spanish to be their first language, and we recruited 2 samples. So heritage Spanish-English bilinguals that were recruited at UC Davis. So I'd mentioned this earlier, but UC Davis has a surplus of heritage Spanish-English bilinguals. And then we also recruited late Spanish-English bilinguals recruited via the online crowdsourcing website, Prolific. And all those participants were residing in Mexico at the time of participation. And on my next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about those samples. But after excluding some of the data, we were left with 91 heritage speakers and 86 late bilinguals. So before moving on to the results, I wanted to show you all just kind of like what the main difference is between heritage speakers and late bilinguals. So on the left here, the bar graphs that are, that the little red square is over the bar graph, this is to show and highlight that typically speaking, at least from what the data that we've been able to collect at UC Davis, heritage bilinguals tend to be on average slightly more proficient in their second language English than they are in their first language. And that's typically because, you know, heritage bilinguals in the United States grow up speaking one language at home. So in this case, it was Spanish. They grow up speaking Spanish at home, and that's their home language, their family language, but they're growing up in an external English environment in this case, right? So their schooling is in English, maybe a lot of their friends speak English, so on and so forth, right? And as they get older, they start to sometimes become, you know, maybe a little bit disconnected with their language as they go off to college and, you know, kind of enter the world in English. And of course, there are a lot of individual differences, you know, everyone, you know, some people might have friends that speak Spanish, so on and so forth. But for the most part, this is sort of like the typical profile that we see with heritage bilingualism in the United States. But then if we take a look at our late bilingual sample, this is a little bit different. So these late Spanish-English bilinguals were all residing in Mexico at the time of participation. They grew up speaking Spanish in their home, but Spanish, instead of the heritage bilinguals, Spanish is their primary language that they're receiving in schooling, the language that they speak with their friends, and so on and so forth, right? So that's sort of the key difference between the 2 groups. And the late bilinguals didn't learn English until high school or college and, you know, around that time, early adulthood, really. Versus the heritage bilinguals are early bilinguals, but the 2 languages in which they learn them are a little bit different. So now that I've talked a little bit more about that, I will jump into the results. So our findings really revealed that the heritage speakers did not show a significant preference for either the noun-adjective or adjective-noun order, but generally rated the adjective-only condition as the least acceptable. So this is really noteworthy because it's suggesting that heritage speakers don't really consider the adjective-only condition, so in this case, el guapo, as acceptable, despite its grammatical correctness within the, you know, noun ellipsis structure in Spanish. So these results are really indicating a lack of differentiation between the adjective-noun and noun-adjective conditions, despite the ungrammatical nature of pronominal descriptive adjectives in Spanish. And with the red box that I have highlighted here for the adjective-noun, it seems that our heritage speakers were rating the adjective noun sentence, so el guapo hombre, which is the, you know, correct structure in Spanish, almost equal to noun adjective. Sorry, el guapo hombre is the English correct structure. They're rating that almost identical to the noun adjective structure in what you would encounter in Spanish, which is rather noteworthy because it doesn't really, you know, it's suggesting that the heritage speakers don't really strongly perceive or attach significance to the distinction between these 2 constructions. And they don't seem to really love the adjective only el guapo construction. But if we take a look at the late bilinguals exhibited a bit of a different response pattern towards the adjective only condition. They generally found it to be grammatical. So the blue, the el guapo, they rated that higher than the heritage bilinguals. And additionally, the late bilinguals rated the adjective noun condition poorly, which was expected of this sample, right? Because el guapo hombre is the English construction or the ordering of what you would encounter in English. So we wouldn't necessarily expect many of our late bilinguals to necessarily, rate these very highly, right? So what does this all imply, right? So the heritage speakers don't appear to attach much significance to the distinction between adjective noun and noun adjective strings. And the asymmetry between the two adjective placement conditions observed in the late bilinguals, but not in the heritage speakers, really suggests a potential influence from English to Spanish among the heritage speakers. Because, since English adjectives are typically placed before nouns, heritage speakers may experience less difficulty processing a similar instruction in Spanish due to their exposure in English, right? But this wasn't really our original intention for wanting to study adjective placement, right? We were wanting to use noun omission and noun ellipsis to be able to study syntactic prediction. But when Fernanda and I had run these acceptability judgments and talked a little bit about this work, we said, this is interesting. These findings are interesting. Let's look into this a little bit more while still considering our original question related to syntactic prediction, but kind of taking a little bit of a segue or like a sidetrack to a bit of a different project. And as V.F. Skinner said, when you run into something interesting, drop everything else and study it. And that leads me to talking about our next step. So our current work of what we're working on right now, and then our proposed research, which is still related to, this original syntactic prediction question that we had. So initially, our proposed research aimed to explore syntactic prediction using noun ellipsis as our targeted structure. However, we found that the heritage speakers tend to perceive both adjective noun and noun adjective conditions as equally good in both, in contrast to the late bilinguals who demonstrate a very clear ability to distinguish between the two. But these are just acceptability judgment ratings. There's a lot of merit to running acceptability judgment tasks, but they don't get at the real true nature of language processing. It's kind of one half, or the way I look at it is it's kind of like one piece of the story. There's so much more to the story that we haven't really looked at, and that is why we're currently running a picture naming task, which is a production task. And this was adapted from an original picture naming task used in a study published in 2016, where they generated, they showed Spanish English bilingual children different images where they were shown like a big train and then a small train, and then they were asked to show, they were asked, ¿Qué ves? What do you see? And then the participants would say una tren, and then they would say, or un tren, and then they would say something like a small train, or whatever they thought was the case. And the participants were able to, the experimenters were able to, collect important data on which ordering these Spanish English bilingual children used. Did they use the correct adjective noun ordering that's encountered in Spanish, so noun adjective, or did they use the correct ordering in English, and did they apply that to Spanish? So we wanted to do the same thing, but with our heritage Spanish English bilinguals at UC Davis and with our late Spanish English bilinguals in Mexico. So we're actually currently running this study right now. And what we did, or what we're doing, is that we generated 40 linguistic trials for this task. And we created a prompt picture and a target picture for each trial, where one object is shown in a circle here, and then the other object is shown there. And the idea is that the two objects are exactly the same, except there's one small difference related to the object. So it could be, in this case, a broken cup. So the difference is that one of the cups is broken. Another difference that we have is that one cup is a different color. It could be a different size. So those are the different conditions that we had. And we're asking our participants, what do you see in the circle, right? We tell them to keep their description simple and just say, what do you see in the circle? How is it different from the other object? And the idea is that we hope that we're able to sort of collect some important data on which adjective noun or noun adjective order sequencing these bilinguals use. Are they using the correct one? Are the heritage bilinguals using the correct one? Or are they sort of behaving similarly as to how we saw in the acceptability judgments, where they are not really caring too much whether or not they use adjective noun or noun adjective in Spanish? But in terms of our predictions, despite what we found for the acceptability judgment ratings data, we really anticipate that the heritage speakers' behavior will align with the late bilinguals, despite the results from our acceptability judgment tasks. And that's because, tasks like self-paced reading or eye tracking measures, or in this case, production tasks, really measure sort of real-time unconscious language processing, unlike acceptability judgments, which involve sort of this kind of like conscious evaluation and post-judgment processing where, you read a sentence and then you're asked to rate on a scale of 1 to 5, how acceptable you think it is. When we're collecting eye tracking data or asking participants to produce, we would expect that maybe they would, behave more similarly to the late bilinguals. And I don't have this on here, but another reason why we expect the heritage bilinguals to behave similarly to the late bilinguals is because, production and comprehension are kind of two sides of the story, right? Heritage bilingualism, a lot of the time, our participants don't have as much experience reading and writing in Spanish as the late bilinguals do. They didn't receive their academic training in Spanish. So a lot of their Spanish experience is through production, through conversation with their family, maybe their friends. So this production task, this picture naming task right here might really allow these heritage bilinguals to, use the correct construction and for us to really kind of get at the underlying question here of adjective placement and which adjective ordering sequence they use. But we still have this sort of big question of what we hope to answer with our work anyways, which was, how does language history affect predictive processing abilities in their first language and just first languages in general, and what this looks like in bilinguals? This like sort of very broad question that I talked about earlier of, can participants use their grammatical knowledge to infer upcoming words? And that's still something that we're very much interested in. It's just that, like I mentioned before, we took a little bit of a side quest because of the findings that we saw from the acceptability judgment task. So now for the rest of my dissertation work, this is definitely something that we will continue to study. But I wanted to show you at least the design of what we hope to do, what we predict, and that will wrap up the presentation and the talk. So for this prediction study in our original study that we designed, we hope to conduct a visual world paradigm task. So the way that this will work, and I'll show this on another screen, but we'll have two conditions based on noun ellipsis manipulation. So noun, which is una camisa amarilla, and then noun ellipsis, just una amarilla. And this will make more sense once I show the stimuli. And then two language proficiency measures where I have same as prior studies, but I didn't talk too much about this. We will do the LEAP-Q, the same language history questionnaire that I used in my previous studies, where participants just self-report their language proficiencies and answer questions related to what age they learn the language, how often they use it. And then we're going to include a more objective measure of language proficiency. So that's called the MINT sprint task, where participants name objects as fast as they can, and they have 3 minutes to do that. And they'll do that in both Spanish and English, and we'll get a score for both Spanish and English for each participant. I'll go back to this sentence, or this slide, but this is kind of what we've designed the study to look like. So again, I mentioned that this is a visual world paradigm task. So participants would listen to these two types of construction, so noun and then noun ellipsis. And then while looking at these 4 images, and of course, these 4 images are going to change with each sentence, but this is the main idea. And so what this sort of looks like is that, so let's say, we have a participant sitting in front of a computer, they're looking at these 4 images, and they're listening to sentences, they might have headphones on, they're listening, and they listen to this following sentence, right? And they get to the word camisa. We don't expect, their fixations to go to anything just yet, because camisa could refer to either the yellow shirt or the blue shirt. But then they hear azul, so camisa azul, and then we would expect that both participants, so we have heritage speakers here on the dotted line, and then the late bilinguals here on the solid line. We would expect the fixation probability to increase for both heritage and late bilinguals, because azul, camisa azul, it's very clear which shirt that is. There's only one, right? But then they get to ila, and then we would expect fixations to kind of probability to kind of level out again. And then it says ila amarilla. So we would expect that the late bilinguals here on the solid line, their fixation probability would increase quite a bit for the yellow shirt, because even though, despite there being two different yellow objects, based off of the sentence that they were given, so María va a traer su camisa azul y va a comprar una María. A María in this sentence would be referring to the yellow shirt based off of that prior information they got about the blue shirt. So we would expect that the fixation probability to increase for yellow shirt. And we do anticipate that both samples will exhibit some level of prediction, but we expect that this effect is, or this prediction effect is going to be more pronounced in the late bilinguals, hence why the solid line is greater than this dashed line or dotted line. So this is really sort of the, a visualization to visualize what we predict. Of course, we haven't run this study yet. This is definitely next steps in my dissertation work, but this is the general paradigm of what we hope to answer by using a visual world paradigm to study syntactic prediction and how people can use their grammatical knowledge to infer upcoming words and structure. But before I end, I wanted to kind of just put everything together and say, why is this important? Why are we studying this? And what do we hope to answer through this? So I talked a lot about like adjective placement, syntactic prediction, and just sort of different components. But despite us taking a bit of a side quest and studying something different at first that's not necessarily related to prediction, this is all important and is all related because by collecting work or by collecting data on different groups of bilinguals, we're really highlighting the importance of understanding both the differences and the similarities that exist between different groups of bilinguals. This has been said a lot in the field of bilingualism and psycholinguistics, but bilingualism is more of a spectrum, right? You can't necessarily clump people into these different samples and say, hey, this person is for sure a late bilingual. This person is for sure a heritage bilingual. I did that in my study for the nature of just being able to, have samples for my study. But at the end of the day, we really must learn to appreciate the unique and multifaceted layers of bilingualism. And there's really so much to the story that we hope to look at, but there's so much that, you can't always control for in your studies, right? And with our heritage bilinguals, despite them not showing the typical effect of what we would expect in the acceptability judgment ratings of the adjective noun sequences, we don't want this to be a way to shame heritage bilinguals for not knowing the right construction or not not rating the construction properly. It's just showing that, language changes are normal, and it might not be a sign that their first language is disappearing. It just might be a sign that, they've had a lot of experience with that second language, and it's impacting the way that they process that first language, or it might not be, right? That's something that we're still sort of trying to figure out. And I think a lot of people in psycholinguistics are trying to figure out as well. But that leads me to wrapping up my presentation. I just wanted to thank you all for listening today. And of course, a big thank you to my lab and to Dr. Fernanda Ferreira, who this work is with. And yeah, thank you all so much. I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you, Beverly. Yes, I have a question.
Sure.
So the Dr. Fernanda is talk.
Pardon?
Can you prepare the talk about more?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Before we continue with questions, I wonder whether Dr. Ferreira wants to wrap up the presentation and we move on to the questions, or we move on to the questions. It's up to you.
Oh, okay. I guess I can just say one or two quick things, and then I'd just love to hear people's feedback on this project, because in some ways you have a very important perspective on this research question. I just wanted to say that as Bev said in the start of her presentation, what at least what I'm really interested in and what motivated this project is the idea of syntactic prediction and the ability of the language system to draw inferences based on syntactic knowledge, based on knowledge of the grammar. And there's a lot of work in prediction, as Bev pointed out, on semantics that's related to semantic prediction and world knowledge, and the fact that people are very likely to fly kites or to eat cakes and so on. But there's far less work on syntactic prediction. And the interesting thing about Spanish and Portuguese has the same property. You can use these you can use these adjectives as nouns, and when you do that, when an adjective occurs, given the noun adjective typical ordering in Spanish, if you get an adjective if you get an adjective and you haven't had a noun yet, there wasn't a preceding noun, then the language processing system should be able to draw the inference that this form is being used as a nominal, and that what's going to follow is some kind of a verb or an adverb or something that relates to that nominal form. So that's really what we're interested in doing. And as Bev said very clearly, very nicely in her presentation, the first thing that we thought we would do was just to be very thorough and a little compulsive and make sure that our Spanish English bilinguals would appreciate the noun adjective ordering in Spanish, and they didn't. And so it kind of blew out the premise of the project. But then, of course, the Spanish English bilinguals in Mexico show the expected pattern. So we think that this has something to do with heritage speakers, and given how much the field and society is interested in the phenomenon of heritage speakers, it's a really important topic to pursue. But I think also the experiments that Bev is doing on the production side and on with the visual world paradigm are also important, because we expect, and I think Bev has also already just peeking at some of the data from the subjects who have been run so far, the heritage speakers are actually respecting the noun adjective rule in Spanish. It's just that when they're given a judgment task, they seem a little bit muddled, or they're not confident about their knowledge of the grammar, which is very common among heritage speakers. So that's so in some ways this is a bit of a confusing project, but we're super excited about it because the kind of confusion that it causes is really interesting to us. It is kind of two things in one. We're exploring the nature of heritage bilingualism, but then we also hope to get back to this other core question about the language processing system, which is its ability to engage in prediction, and in this case, prediction that's based on syntactic knowledge rather than semantic knowledge, because syntactic prediction is so understudied. So I don't know if that's kind of what you were looking for from me at this.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We have many questions, so I think we are going to move on to the questions, and you can continue some ideas then. So one of them is, if adjective plus noun is grammatically valid in Spanish, why do late bilinguals rate its acceptability so low?
Yeah, that is a very good question. So just to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly, and feel free to whoever asked that question to chime in or in the chat. But so there are some adjectives in Spanish that, you know, obviously, as you all know, that can be used pronominally, so the adjective noun sequence. But we had controlled or tried our best to control when we had done the acceptability judgment task to only include descriptive adjectives that could be used post-nominally. So that way, you know, because that way there wasn't the potential for that interference to sort of come into play. You know, one example that comes to mind is, you know, when you're referring to an old friend. So it's, you know, you could say like, mi viejo amigo or amigo viejo, like depending on which ordering of it, if I'm understanding that correctly, it might slightly change the way that that is interpreted. So it could be a friend that you've known for a long time, or it could be a friend that is old in age, right? So we didn't want to include those adjective noun sequences or those descriptive adjectives in our study to avoid just that from happening. So we wanted to make sure that the adjectives were descriptive adjectives that are only used post-nominally. And we'd run it by a few different people. Actually, we run it by my mom, who is a Spanish-English bilingual, and then a few other people who are like non-heritage Spanish-English bilinguals to double check. But of course, there's always the room for, you know, error with some of these things. And that was also kind of what we were hoping to answer with the acceptability judgments, is to throw out some of those sentences that participants rated very poorly. So I'm not sure if that answered participants or that person's question, but feel free to chime in.
Yeah, thank you.
And if I could just add, I would.
Please.
Yeah, sure.
Is it okay if I just add a quick thing? So I just wanted to say that it's a really interesting question, and in some ways I would turn it the other way and say I would ask, and I think we are asking why the heritage bilinguals are accepting the adjective noun sequence rather than why are the late bilinguals not accepting adjective noun sequences, because I think it's fairly established that the grammar of Spanish is such that, you know, almost always the noun precedes the adjective. So really the question that we're trying to uncover or get the answer to is what is making the heritage speakers say that adjective noun sequences are okay when, as we expect to find in the production experiment and the few subjects Bev has run seems to corroborate this, they don't produce them. So at some level they know that they're not okay. So we think it has to do with the meta-linguistic nature of the acceptability judgment task. And when people have to make grammaticality judgments, a lot of things go into those decisions beyond just the grammar. A lot of feelings of, you know, I was just saying the other day to somebody, as a heritage speaker of Portuguese, every time I've realized that a word that we used in my family for an object in Portuguese is in fact the word that other people use, I feel a sense of relief that, oh, it's not just some word we used in our house, or it's not just the dialect that my parents happen to speak. You know, we kind of lack confidence in our knowledge of the language. I mean, maybe I should speak for myself. I don't think all heritage speakers do, but grammaticality judgments are kind of putting you on the spot, and perhaps they are just a little less sure of their knowledge of the grammar.
Thank you. We have a few questions about gender, so I'm going to try to merge them. Have you considered the effect of the gender coherence between article, adjective in the sentences in Spanish? For instance, el guapo versus la guapa. I think you probably need to control for the gender of the competitors, because another reason why participants might avoid fixation on the yellow cat is because it is masculine and the article is feminine. So someone else is as well wondering about the pair, for example, in the hat shoes, where maybe a different gender or not. How do you decide these issues of the gender?
Yeah, that is a really great point, and thank you to the person who brought that up. Yeah, this was definitely something that had come up when I'd given this presentation for my qualifying exam last year, and the issue of gender had brought up had been brought up in that context, and that was something that I, you know, taking a step back, like was something that I had not considered when, you know, designing this study and designing some of the stimuli that we want to use, at least for the visual world paradigm study. So that's certainly something that I think we will have to do. So with the La Maria, so the two different nouns, like trying to make sure that we're using the same, so they're both feminine or both masculine, and not one feminine, not one not one masculine. And I know that there is some syntactic prediction work on gender in Spanish. So a lot of the time people will either show participants a sentence that says la, and then they're you know, they have to correctly select the right noun. I'm not too familiar with that work, but at least on the topic of gender, that's something that I haven't considered too much, and that's certainly extremely important and something that I should definitely take into consideration when we're designing the stimuli for the visual world paradigm task, and something to consider too, I think, for the picture naming task. But yeah, Fernanda, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that, but that is a really good point, and thank you to the person.
No, just that is a, yeah. And Bev, I'm just making a note of it for us so that you can keep focusing on answering the questions, but I'm going to put a note in our Slack so that you, yeah. So,
thank you. Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. The next question is a double question. For the picture naming task, do speakers omit the use of the noun, which fully redundant and uninformative? This is the first question. And the second question is it a frequent case given that noun ellipsis is more natural in Spanish?
Yeah, so to, thank you for that question. So to answer the first question, so we've just started collecting data on this with the heritage bilinguals at UC Davis, and we're currently getting ready to start collecting data with our collaborators, Mexico. But so we haven't, you know, when I've peeked at the data, I haven't seen that the heritage bilinguals are omitting the noun at all. I think it's because when they're given the instructions for the task, the instructions are very clear cut, where they say, you know, you just have to describe what's in the circle. So what do you see? So for them, it's just very natural to say, you know, the broken cup, like what you see on this image right here, rather than la rota or like something else. But that, you know, that's certainly an interesting point, because I had not thought that, you know, there is the possibility of participants just completely omitting the noun and just using the adjective. But I think, you know, with the instructions that we give them and the nature of the task, I think that the participants are going to be using the noun to pair with the adjective. It's just a matter of like which order they're going to be using. And so far, when taking a look at the data, as Fernanda has suggested, it seems like the heritage bilinguals are using the correct ordering of what we would expect from the late bilinguals. So they're using the noun adjective sequence to describe something like this, like the broken cup. And then to answer the second question, so actually, sorry, do you mind reminding me of what the second question was? I'd forgotten the last part of it.
The second part of the question, let me find it, was, is it a frequent case given that noun ellipsis is more natural in Spanish?
Definitely.
It was related with the first,
Yeah. So in this, at least in this context, so like with, let me see, we'll go back to, okay, I should probably, yeah, I'll just show this one. Yeah, so at least in this case, with, like, if we're just talking simply about noun omission and omitting the noun and just referring to someone as the adjective, this is something that we, based off of conversations that we've had with other Spanish language bilinguals, but also stuff that I've read, and also from my own knowledge of the language, this is much more natural in Spanish and something that just wouldn't be really acceptable in English. Like, you know, if you said something like this sentence would translate to, the woman is looking for the handsome that has a cat. So in English, you would have to say something like, the woman is looking for the handsome person or the handsome man that has a cat, right? You wouldn't be able to just simply say the handsome. So based off of this noun omission principle, this would be considered much more natural in Spanish. But of course, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that sometimes it's common to refer to someone as el guapo or la bonita, you know, to refer to people at least. So that was kind of the main intention with using word adjectives like this, is that they are commonly used as you know, nouns to refer to people, or la flaca, or, you know, I know that's a common one. We try not to use that in our stimuli, but that I know is a common nickname that people have.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For what it's worth,
yeah.
I asked ChatGPT to translate Mary bought a blue dress and a yellow dress, and it translated as, in Spanish, that would be María compró un vestido azul y un amarelo.
Yeah. Right.
Okay.
That's very interesting that ChatGPT is using that.
Yeah. A huge question that requires a huge answer, but I'm sure one of you can give us some ideas. What is the interaction between semantic and syntactic predictions?
It's a great question. Fernanda, I might hand this off to you. If you want to take that away.
Well, so if you assume that semantic representations are built on a syntactic frame, then essentially anytime, as Bev said in this part of her talk, anytime you're making a semantic prediction, the comprehension system is also making a prediction about the part of speech and where it fits in to the grammatical structure and so on. So all of that syntactic prediction is kind of happening under the hood, as it were, when people are making a semantic prediction. It's just it's because it's under the hood, so people are just kind of taking it for granted. But part of my interest in syntactic prediction is that in my past work on topics like reanalysis in syntactic processing and restructuring of syntactic structures, I've been heavily influenced by the ideas of Janet Fodor and Patrick Sturch and so on, who have argued that reanalysis involves restructuring. So when you get a garden path sentence, what you have to do is fix the syntactic tree. And the way that you do that is that you rely on your grammatical knowledge to make inferences about what would be the right structure to create at this point in order to make the overall structure grammatical. So extending that to the realm of prediction, it seems quite possible to think that when you get a certain amount of the linguistic input in a sentence, you can make inferences about what the next syntactic unit is likely to be, even if you don't yet know what the word is likely to be, and that would be based pretty much on the person's knowledge of the grammar of that language. And in fact, we've argued in some earlier papers that any kind of a garden path, a syntactic garden path, occurs because of syntactic prediction. That if you get something like Mary believed Tom was lying, if you get a sentence like that, you get garden pathed it was. The reason that you're being garden pathed is that you made the syntactic prediction that Tom was a direct object rather than the subject of a complement clause. So we think there is syntactic prediction happening fundamentally anytime that there's semantic prediction happening as well, but that given the priority of syntax in comprehension, or at least the idea that you often are building semantic representations on syntactic structures, it's also important to study syntactic prediction on its own, where it might not be based at all on semantic knowledge, but just on the rules of the grammar, which allow the parser to draw certain kinds of syntactic inferences.
Thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, we have to finish. So we thank you so much, Beverly and Dr. Freire, for your participation. And we have many people on YouTube that is also thank you and who are very happy with your talk. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure.
Muchas gracias a nuestro auditorio.
Gracias.
Thank you so much.